Hello and welcome to another edition of Flanking Thoughts here at the 11th OVC. Again, we're going to talk about Lessons of a Decade by Frederick Whitaker. And again, we have the pleasure of introducing Bob O'Neill. If you haven't seen his intro and his story, please look at the previous videos we've done. We'll link it up here. But for now, we're going to go straight into the next chapter that we're talking about, which is Whitaker's take on dismounted fighting or fighting on foot from a cavalry perspective. And I'll open this conversation by what he says. He says, in 2 minutes from the word prepare to fight on foot, a line of 3/4 of men is formed to go to the front at a run, while the column of horses led by the number 4 man out of each set is moved off to the rear out of danger of stray bullets. He continues to go on and say, European cavalry officers and the world at large have no conception of the extent at which dismounted fighting was used in the American Civil War and the perfection attained in it by our men after very little practice. And he actually talks about the 1840s manual, kind of doesn't name it, but references the Poinsettias manual, in which it does talk about dismounting, fighting on foot. But what he says is what ended up happening in the Civil War was a, quote, American innovation that our country being much covered with woods, mounted fighting is almost impracticable, but men accustomed to fighting on foot, no country is difficult. So with that big opening, and of course, from your perspective and our kind of dichotomy of the academic historian side of things versus the experiential archaeology or the reenacting side of things, what's your overall take of how the cavalry did dismount and why they did it, and just the overall take of fighting on foot?
I think first off, it became a necessity. I think everything he says, I agree with. I think he's pretty much spot on there in his assessment of it. It became a necessity, but it was going to take time. It was not something that was going to happen,
right?
Up front, because remember the pre-war cavalry, you had essentially light cavalry, mounted rifles, and dragoons. Each of them had a different function. Well, all those kind of merged together in the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And so as the cavalry was better armed to do that, as we talked about earlier in a previous episode, gave them more value to the Army. And it earned the respect, I think, of their infantry comrades. But it was not going to happen overnight. So there's one of the things that was prevalent in the early part of the war, because commanders didn't know how to employ cavalry, was in a set-piece battle like Gaines's Mill. We talked about the charge of the 5th U.S. at Gaines's Mill for a minute earlier. They would just assign the cavalry to defend artillery batteries. And they really had no way to effectively do that. The only way cavalry could defend ground was to attack, because they didn't have the weapons to defend ground with. And so the whole notion was kind of foolhardy. When carbines came on in numbers that allowed them to start fighting like that, not only did it become very prevalent, it earned them the respect, I believe, of their infantry comrades who had a chance to see them do it.
Yeah, and actually you talked about that in one of our previous episodes of, once the cavalry, from a large extent, had all 3 weapons, that really allowed them to be offensive, defensive, in addition to close, medium, and long-ish range.
Right.
And made the cavalry one of the best arms out there as far as capabilities and, I guess, variety of what they could do.
Yep. Versatility on the battlefield is going to make you that much more valuable to a commander.
So the question is, how often did cavalry fight on foot versus actually stay mounted? I mean, so whether we're talking Trevilian or Winchester or Brandy Station or East Cavalry Field in Gettysburg, or all the different engagements that we think of cavalry, I mean, we don't necessarily know the ratio, but what would you say from what you've studied of staying mounted versus dismounting then? I mean, what was more normal, in a way?
In part, it depended on the terrain, I think.
Yeah,
the terrain would dictate part of it.
Yeah.
Early in the war, I don't, and I might come up with an idea later on, but
Right, that's
early
right.
in the war, I don't know a lot of instances in which they are fighting dismounted. But again, they don't have, in many cases, the ability to fight dismounted. But come early 1863, at Kelly's Ford, there's dismounted fighting. At Brandy Station, there's dismounted fighting for long periods of time. Some of the toughest fighting at Brandy Station is dismounted fighting. At Aldie, the Confederate Cavalry sets a bloody ambush for the Federals with their dismounted fighting. At Middleburg, it's almost like listening to his description. They filed into a field, they come down, the Federals come down the turnpike, file into a field, it's a mile long.
Right.
Every fourth man takes the horses, they form a skirmish line that's almost that long then, just like he's talking about. And they worked in conjunction. They had a couple of companies of mounted men kind of in reserve behind them that could help exploit a success. They advance across a wide expanse of ground on foot. They could have done it on horseback, but they were going to then move into woods. So they do it in an open skirmish line formation, and once they get the enemy on the run, the mounted reserves come up, kind of keep them on the run. At Upperville, most of the fighting that morning is, and there's infantry there, there's infantry at Brandy Station that's helping, is dismounted fighting on foot. In the early morning, it's almost all infantry, but the cavalry's working in conjunction with them. The cavalry starts taking over some of that. Once the infantry drops out, then it becomes all mounted fighting. But it shows that there's that progression there where they're moving very easily between one or the other as the ground dictated, or as the commander's needs dictated. So at Upperville, they've got a lot of broken ground. It's ridges and ravines, bridges, and all that ground in the Loudon Valley fighting, Aldie, Middleburg, and Upperville, June, is highlighted by stone walls. So all that ground is cut up by very stout stone fences or stone walls, which was easy. It was a natural defensive position there. So both sides took advantage of it. That kind of dictated part of the dismounted part of it. But once they got into open ground, they just got on their horses.
Right.
And they transitioned back to the more traditional, light cavalry tactics. So it's very much, as he said, and I think that worked very well. And by later in the war, the cavalry really begins to prove their worth at places, and he talks about it in one of the chapters of Cold Harbor.
Yes, actually,
They have some very tough dismounted fighting, waiting for the infantry to come up, trying to hold the crossroads at Cold Harbor. They let it go because they think if I have my facts straight, it is 1864. They let it go, and then they're told, no, the infantry's not here. We need to go back and take it over again. So that becomes much more prevalent. You mentioned Trevilian's, a lot of dismounted fighting there.
Right.
Very, very tough fight at Trevilian Station. And maybe on a per soldier basis, the Battle of Hawes Shop, which I think is like May 28, 1864, is just a straight up stand there at a few hundred yards range and just shoot each other down. Very, very tough fight. High casualty rate, almost all dismounted fighting. So it would become more prevalent. And as I said, it made them more versatile, and I think then made them more valuable. And after Brandy Station, and again at Upperville, they were fighting alongside infantry. And you see a lot of letters, not just one or two, but there's a lot of them that said, we had never seen the cavalry actually fight before. And the infantry had denigrated them for years and what have you. And when I read these letters, I don't think they mean it as denigrating. They just said, we had never really seen them in action before. And now we've had a chance to see them. We see what they can do, and they gained, that respect for them as well.
It's interesting because, like we've said in previous episodes, Whitaker, when he writes this chapter, he always seems to have a focus, and the focus that he seems to have on the dismounted effect or the effect that dismounted fighting had on the cavalry or on the battlefield in general was the ability of them to, as he puts, dash to and fro or back and forth, get off, fight, remount and go without fatiguing the soldiers. And so this is, I'll kind of read this statement here, and we can kind of see what he's saying beyond that. So he says, the dash and impetuosity of the dismounted skirmish line is far beyond that of the infantry force of equal numbers. He says the men come into action perfectly fresh. It is a positive relief to get out of the saddle after a long day's riding. And I love how he puts that little sentence in there, because those of us who have ridden, long distances and long riding, you can't wait to get out of the saddle. Of course, it doesn't take too long of walking and running that you want to get back in the saddle again. But it continues on saying, all the fighting is done at a quick run, and you cannot get the infantry line to move so fast. They know well that if they tire themselves out running, they will pay for it on the march out. But the cavalryman is not fatigued. He has no knapsack to weigh him down. His saber is left on the saddle, which I want to get to in a little bit. He left his saber on the saddle. He fights altogether on a skirmish line and can do much damage without suffering proportionally to the infantry. He said the destructive strength of that thin, elastic line of skirmishers was amazing. So he basically says that the cavalry, as mounted infantry or as dragoons, whatever you want to say, is to go to a place and take quick, effective action, whereas the infantry would walk everywhere, whereas it basically says, here at least he implies, or not implies, he actually explicitly states that cavalry ran everywhere on foot. Is there any, have you run across any references to that, dismounted skirmishing? Or I guess what's your take on, is he being a little bit more romantic than actually what happened, or what do you think?
I suspect you would know this better than I do. What might be important in that, in determining the reality of that, is the footwear of the cavalryman. So
yeah,
not every cavalryman, if I understand this right, wore, the knee high or the mid leg length boots. Yep. A lot of them wore more of a short ankle length brogan or whatever.
Yeah.
So some of those boots, those men, for instance I think of is the prisoners that were captured in the Loudoun Valley fighting, the federal prisoners. They were made to march to Winchester, then they were made to march down to Stanton, down the Shenandoah Valley, or up the Shenandoah Valley. And then they marched either to Gordonsville, got a train to Richmond prisons, but they weren't used to doing that walking.
Right, yeah.
And so some of them, that was the hardest part of it for them. They were not conditioned to long walking. So I think certain footwear would have been easier to do it in than others. We have the image of they're all wearing a high boot.
High boot, yeah, exactly. Now the 12-inch boot, I mean, as far as just issue, the 12-inch boot was the common one. And now in a lot of photos, looking at original photos from the Library of Congress or wherever, you only can see really how big the boots are if they wear them outside.
Right.
But if they put the cuffs or the pants over them, like, as far as, official, military expectations or wear or dress, whatever, where they put their pants over their boots, you can't quite tell if they're the issue 12-inch boot or the higher boot or anything like that, or if they're wearing brogans or the shoes, the booties or anything like that. But from my perspective, running, and what's funny is my dad says the same thing. Running in brogans or these period footwear without like hobnails or some type of cleat in them, man, you're slipping all over the place in the grass. You have very little traction at all in those leather soles. So that would have been interesting. But, according to Whitaker, I just find it interesting that he actually specifically says all fighting is done at a quick run.
I think that's probably an overstatement. Certainly the fight at Middleburg, they're on that dismounted skirmish line for an extended period of time of an hour or more, and they're just kind of trading fire, moving slowly. The fight at the skirmish line, the dismounted fighting at Brandy Station, as I understand it, is certainly not all done at a run. It's a lot of stationary, slugging it out type of fighting. Trevilian's, I think, is
similar.
I believe. I haven't looked at that in a long time. So I think that is an overstatement, but generally speaking, I think what he's saying there is something that I have to agree with. Now,
one thing too is interesting, I said I'll come back to, is that he kind of says it with as a kind of an expectation or a duh statement, but he says as a saber is left on the saddle, then nothing's weighing him down. And I find that interesting because early war, There's little evidence to say that they put their sabers on their saddles, but late war, toward 64 and on, there's definitely some significant evidence that that's what cavalry troopers did. There's some diaries and some letters that mention that, and there's other regimental histories, and that's what I love about the primary research that we're able to do. Is there's a lot of detail packed in some of these regimental histories that, thank goodness, they threw in that detail in a normal narrative that I'm sure they didn't think about. But a lot of 64 and on, it seems like a lot of troopers or a lot of regiments put their sabers on their saddles, and those of us who have done it, or especially the original cast, running on the ground with a saber attached to you it's kind of a pain.
So I've never experienced it. The little riding I did, as we talked about out in Montana, I did have a saber both ways just because I wanted to get an idea of it. But to your point, this is some notes I took from an Army circular dated June 9, 1864, and this came down from the Secretary of War.
Okay.
And it's very wide-ranging about the cavalry, and it says, if I can read it at some length, towards the conclusion of it, our cavalry service is peculiar. The wooded terrain fixes the true character of this arm to be simply mounted infantry, and the true use of the horse to be only a means of transportation. Cavalry, therefore, as a rule, should be armed with carbines of long range, breech loading and repeating. The ammunition should be metallic, as those of paper too soon become damaged. So this kind of sums up a lot of what we've already talked about. As opportunities for using the saber are rare, this arm could be dispensed with altogether. If the saber is worn, it should be fastened to the saddle under the stirrup leather. And he goes on and says, the enemy will generally be found in positions either in woods or covered by a ditch or stream, or be able to readily fall back before being seriously engaged. Cavalry, therefore, must be dismounted and led to the assault as infantry. Horses furnish the means of rapidly turning the enemy's position by detachments from the main column. Now, what's interesting is, in the same order, and almost right after that, they write, this service is so different from the infantry that the practice of the latter can, in very few particulars, be a guide for the former. If it is only by unremitting attention to their duties that officers can preserve their horses and keep up the discipline of their command. So that part of that order, as you said, the transition period is 1864 thereabouts, putting it on the saddle. So, we've all probably seen, in the era a couple decades ago when the military prints were really popular.
Right.
There's some that show in 1865 Union cavalrymen charging on foot with their sabers on their belts. Probably was not going to be realistic. You certainly can't say with any certainty it was. Any particular account might have been different, but I think it does. That kind of sums up a lot of the different things we're talking about in terms of how the transition was coming about.
Whitaker, it was kind of interesting too, in talking about the size of the cavalry corps. In fact, he says a large force is practically impossible to turn as far as dismounted cavalry. And he says 10,000 cavalry, such as the cavalry corps of the Army of the Potomac once possessed, would form a battle line 3 to 5 miles long. Thin as the line was, woe be it to the enemy that massed heavy forces to pierce it. And he goes on to describe that many Confederate regiments would try to pierce that thin line, but then be pushed back multiple times. Again, you got to filter the romance of that a little bit, but I'm just trying to think of the cavalry corps was 10,000 cavalry. And we talked about this earlier on today a little bit, but the idea of pre-Civil War, the vast majority of the time you were talking squadron or regiment size engagements or dealings or dispatches or details, and then post-Civil War, kind of the same thing along the Indian War side of things. And so really what's unique about, what's neat about the Civil War, especially mid to late war on the federal side, is you had the actual Army of Potomac Cavalry Corps, this number of horses that really hasn't been seen working together as one body, and it really for a long time. I mean, just...
So after World War I, of course, there certainly isn't. And
Yeah.
there's an incident which Hollywood has maybe over dramatized, but it's a movie I really enjoy watching called the Light Horseman. Have you
Yeah.
ever
Oh, yeah. That's
and
that's
the
a good
charge
one.
of
Yeah.
Beersheba? But I think here he probably, my impression is he oversteps again a little bit here.
Yeah.
That a skirmish line, you tell me if I'm wrong, meant that the men were stationed, spaced 15 feet apart or thereabouts.
Yeah, you bet about. Yeah.
5 paces, 15 feet, something like that. Well, there's two instances when you take irregular warfare, so to speak, against formation tactics, in which they overran a skirmish line. In the Zulu Wars in South Africa in the 1870s, they had pretty much figured out that the British infantry was fighting in a skirmish order very similar to what he's talking about here, and that the natives, the Zulus, they knew they could break that line very easily. You just had to be dedicated enough to get a gap in it.
Yeah.
Know you were going to take a couple losses, get a gap. Well, as soon as you take one man out, now you have a 30-foot gap.
Yeah.
And now you have men defending. If you think about it, on the ends, I think it would work out to both sides. One man is working almost 45 feet to defend with a single-shot weapon. And the same thing happens at the Little Bighorn. There's some dismounted fighting there on the same kind of skirmish order, and they start to the Indians break those down because they were willing to risk and lose a few men to open those gaps up. So here, I think when he says, his wording is a little over the top about, resisting, these dedicated attacks. I don't know, it worked in the right situation, but I don't know that an open order skirmish line is going to stand up to a mounted assault or something like that, the way he seems to remember it was going to.
Yeah, well, hindsight always looks rosy, more rosy than it really was, possibly. In fact, he actually goes on to say here, the experiment was tried on both sides and always to be repented of. And that's talking about the infantry, or I guess another, full force attacking the skirmish line. And of course, he's saying that they would try and they would repent of it. Again, some of that colorful language. He says the skirmish line would give back in one place only to advance in another. The enemy, overwhelmed by crossfire from a semicircle of invisible foes, I love the language here, finally fell back in every instance with heavy losses. The only way to drive a skirmish line is to flank it and threaten the lead horses, which again kind of goes back to little colorful language, but I guess the point that he's trying to make is and especially being a unique American experiment, the dismounted skirmish line is really what the American cavalry, and even I guess you could argue the Confederate cavalry, really relied on heavily throughout the war.
The Confederate cavalry is going to become very much employed very much the same way as the Northern cavalry later in the war. As they get more carbines and are able to hold ground, they're going to do more of that as well. It was all dependent on their ability to get the weapons, the manpower, and what have you to do it. And once they did, I think both sides became rather effective at it.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, one thing too he brings up, and you actually kind of mentioned this at Brandy Station. He says that open fields were fought on mounted, and our line of battle in corps front was always formed in one way. Each brigade detached one of its regiments to cover its whole front, off half a mile long, with a chain of skirmishers. 2 or more regiments followed behind, each with about 200 yards apart, in line with sabers drawn. The rest of the brigade formed a third line in column of 4s. And so, I guess from a reenacting perspective, seeing this, it goes back to his previous statement of having a cavalry corps, something that hasn't been seen in America in a long time. I'm not familiar with the Mexican War. I don't know numbers wise. I just don't think they had those numbers then. I could be totally wrong though. But or War of 1812 even. I'm completely ignorant on those things. But I just don't see 10,000 troopers in a field at one time. But I do find it interesting how even for large fields they're fought on mounted, but they still had the skirmish lines go forward.
So
what's your take on that?
I kind of shake my head at that a little bit.
Really? Okay.
And again, someone calls me on it.
Right. I'm
I'll
sure
be
you'll have
happy to
some
listen.
haters in the comments, but that's
But there's at Brandy Station there was Brigade Fighting there around Fleetwood Hill.
actually, if can I interrupt you here? It actually says on the brigades at Brandy Station average 4 regiments, sometimes 5, on open ground, such as in Central Virginia around Brandy Station. The mounted fighting was of the most inspiring, romantic, and thoroughly delightful kind.
And I think that's what he falls back on. I think that is, and there is, I don't think there's any question. If you survived it,
You're right.
it was probably exhilarating.
Oh, I'm sure.
It was probably an adrenaline rush. And again, if you survive it, that you build some confidence in yourself and your ability. And I don't think there's any question that's what some of these men went into the cavalry for, was to do that. So we will all love,
All right.
to have a chance to see something like that
yeah.
and know that we were going to survive it.
Right.
To see it. But I don't, someone, Bud Hall or someone would maybe tell me different, or Andy German. When you see like Kilpatrick's brigade going into an attack at Fleetwood Hill, or Wyndham's brigade going into attack, yes, they're all about 4 regiments in strength, but I don't know of any accounts where they were putting skirmishers out in front of them. Now, when you're moving across open territory, they would have flankers out and advance guard and things like that. But the way he describes it there, to me, causes me to shake my head a little bit.
Yeah.
But I'm certainly, if someone tells me
Right.
I'm wrong, that's fine with me. But there was not that much brigade fighting in cavalry. And part of the problem with the terrain was it was not conducive to that much cavalry moving around, and you had to have the right terrain. You need, and you know better than I do, it's not just the width of the field to move a column of cavalry, but they have to have room to turn, maneuver,
Oh, yeah.
recover.
It takes some room.
So it's more than just a brigade, a regimental front or something. So a lot of it becomes this basic fighting unit, in my mind, is the squadron.
Right.
So it's a much smaller function, much easier to control, and that's where you see used a lot more often than actual, a brigade. And that's why the fighting at 3rd Winchester, when you have essentially, I think, 3 divisions of cavalry going in all, or 3 brigades going in there, it's almost a one-off event. It's so unique that, they still talk about that in with some degree of awe, what that must have been like, because they were
unreal.
But even then, I don't never seen an account where they were fighting behind a skirmish line in front of them as they went into action. So that's the only part of that I would take a little exception to.
Right. And he does actually, he does kind of compare the dichotomy of open fields versus wooded fields being mounted versus dismounted fighting. He actually closes this chapter of his book by saying that these were, so open fields, meaning open fields were the only places where saber charges were possible, and several times we shared in their wild intoxication. Again, that romantic language. Glorious days were those, and green to the memory of those who shared in them in the fall of 63 in that delightful climate. However, he finishes with saying, whenever Woods intervened in the mounted skirmish line, whenever Woods intervened, the mounted skirmish line was dismounted, and each squadron officer, talking about the size of the units there, the squadron size officer, attending to his own squadron, and the woods cleared on foot. When the ground opened up again, 4 legs superseded 2.
And I think that's, again, he kind of drifts off, I think, the part a little bit.
Right.
But it's hard for me to go back and call a veteran out,
Well, it is,
again. But,
right.
I think there is a little bit of the romantic part of it, certainly around a veterans reunion. I'm sure they spoke more about Brandy Station and the charges there at East Cavalry Field
Right.
than they did about just standing up and slugging it out at carbine range,
Right.
150 or 200 yards, something like that, and just trading lead. So there were certain things that were going to make more of an impression in their head. And, they don't describe these in their diaries very much because they didn't have time to look around.
Yeah,
And the speed of that better than I do. But it had to have been something to be a part of that. I don't think there's any question
imagine,
about it.
yeah. Well, I mean, just like I said, the most horses I've seen in one field at an event, I believe, were anywhere between 300 to 500. And I mean, that shook the ground when we were moving all at once. And I mean, I couldn't imagine a corps or even a full regiment. Well, you could argue 300 to 500 is getting close, but still, I mean, it's just crazy to be able to be a part of that. But like you said, do you risk being involved at the risk of not surviving? For those that did survive, you can look back and knowing that you did survive, look and appreciate the as he says, the intoxicating exhilaration of the moment. And maybe dismounted fighting wasn't romantic, but it definitely got the job done. And
that's the thing.
Exactly. And I think, I guess, closing this chapter out, that's what he ends on, is whenever the woods intervened, which was the definition of an Eastern American terrain, they dismounted, fought on foot. I mean, he earlier on in the chapter, he talks about cavalry, as a rear guard when they were retreating or falling back from some type of campaign. They would easily dismount. They would get in the trees, easily, protect the flanks or protect the rear. And then when they're ready, they knew that they could just hop on their horses, go to the next defensive position. So he definitely at least gives credence to that tactic.
Well, and I think comparing it to an infantry skirmish line, if an infantryman, you wait too long, you only have your own
feet.
Your own feet to get you out of there.
Right.
And if you've been out in the sun and you haven't had anything to eat that day, and you haven't had a sip of your canteen and you're dehydrated, and all those things are going to have an impact on how quickly you're going to get away. Well, if you know that's going to be an issue, you're not going to be willing to stay out there to the last minute, so to speak.
Exactly.
And I think that, again, he's right, that knowing that it's just a matter of getting those horses up to you, getting back to them, and getting out of there, you've got something that's fresh, that's going to get you out of there that much quicker.
And actually, one thing what I like he says is, as a partnership of the horse and the trooper working together, when the horse is working, that means the trooper is resting, generally. Of course, those who ride a lot, you don't feel like you're resting, but you're not really doing an aerobic or even anaerobic workout. But then he also says that when the trooper is running on the ground, the horse is resting.
Right.
And that way you always are fresh. One's fresh to then move on or run. The other one can dismount and then run, and then you mount up on a fresh horse. So, I mean, overall, kind of closing out this episode, your overall thoughts, mounted versus dismounted, obviously it was effective in the war. Who do you think did it better? Maybe I should ask that. Kind of a little trivia question. On the Confederate side or the Union side, who really perfected that dismounted?
I think probably the Federals, and I don't want to sound
well, you
too
are a
biased
Federal guy,
for by being a Northerner, but they had the equipment, as they get the Spencers and other things that are going to give them a little bit that much more of an advantage in that. It's going to help them later in the war. They still have the horse supply issues that are going to keep them fresh. And so there are other issues that are mitigating against the effectiveness of the Confederate troopers. But, one of the things that we talked about off camera that I disagree with him on, he said that once they were formed as a cavalry corps in early 1863, that they never lost again. Well, that's completely off.
Not quite realistic.
Not realistic at all. And the Confederate cavalry, on some of their days when you just think, how are they doing this? They were still pulling off what some might look at as miracles. They were still driving the Federal cavalry. So there was, from day to day, you didn't know who was going to have the advantage. But I think overall, by the later part of the war, the Federals did.
Awesome. Well, with that, we'll go ahead and close this chapter of Dismounted Fighting. Appreciate you guys watching us on YouTube. Please like us on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and catch us for the next episode for the next chapter. Thanks again, and have a great day.